top story, and COVID protests are taking place in Melbourne.
Despite almost all restrictions for the vaccinated being lifted, this is what it looks like. Tens of thousands of people looping around the CBD. There's actually two rallies going on at the moment. So there's this one here, which we're at, but there's also another one, and that's with those who are anti the far-right movement. So thousands of demonstrators once again taking to the streets. Regrettably, Janie, there also seems to be quite a strong anti-media sentiment.
Good afternoon. Thousands of protesters from opposing groups have marched through Melbourne CBD.
For yet another week, thousands upon thousands of protesters, that's the mostly peaceful crowd.
As the majority of happily vaccinated Australians got on with life today, a vocal minority of irate and noisy protesters took to the streets across the country to rail against perceived threats to their freedom. There were even protests against the protests in several cities. The biggest turnout was in Melbourne.
Police estimate that tens of thousands of people attended today's Freedom Rally. Nearby, an anti-fascist protest took place, with these protesters condemning those refusing the vaccine and labelling them as Nazis. They remained mostly civil.
Premier, did you get on the beers last night?
If the message of extremist anti-vaxxers was working, if it was reflected, as you say, in the general public, I wouldn't be standing here today talking about the fact that 90% of people have gone and got one dose and then two. Debate's not an unhealthy thing. Violence is, though. This is a 1 in 100 year event. When Victorians stick together, we can achieve anything. People don't want to be served by somebody who hasn't been vaccinated. People don't want to be sitting next to or sharing a space with people that have not been vaccinated. We have to make sure that we quarantine people who are not vaccinated, whether it's violent extremism, the votes of extremists.
He's punching
us. How is your relationship with the Prime Minister at the moment, Premier?
Well, it'll be a lot better when he stops double speaking to extremists.
And I wouldn't want the appalling, the disgusting and the potentially criminal behaviour of a small number of people to detract away from the amazing job that so many Victorians have done.
Because the Prime Minister is pandering to these extremist elements. He is doing a wink and a nod and a dog whistle to extremist elements.
SBS World News.
With a crowd numbering in their thousands staging a largely peaceful demonstration.
Security dragging this man from a mostly peaceful crowd.
No, but a small number of the thousands upon thousands who are here in the gardens have returned to the front steps of Parliament. This is a live shot from our helicopter.
Thousands of protesters are rallying in Melbourne again today.
Well, Danica, there'd be at least 10,000 people here. We asked.
No one's sure what the exact crowd number was, but it's been put in the tens of thousands.
Probably the biggest, tens of thousands of people. I don't know the number.
Yeah, well, picking up on what you said, Darren, just this division just seems to be getting bigger. It doesn't seem to be getting smaller. That is definitely something that hopefully can be addressed.
This means Victorians can pack dance floors and even stand up to drink their beer. And they can do so without having to wear a mask. You only get...
You know, at the end of the day, it's taken too long for some to call out this sort of violence.
Sally, we've seen some pretty ugly protests throughout the week.
It has been really disappointing to see those protesters creating mayhem up around Parliament House.
It's a tough one, isn't it? Because, I mean, everyone around Australia looks at those images. You in Melbourne know that it's only a small number of people making a very loud noise.
Because those images of Melbourne, it's not an example of what's happening around Melbourne. As I said, hundreds of thousands of people coming back.
Do you accept there are legitimate community concerns about this legislation?
Well, what I accept and what I have always defended and been a very strong supporter of, Carl, is people's right to protest. But if it's not peaceful, it's not protest. It's something very, very different. And we've seen absolute extremists, rabid anti-vaxxers and others. If Victorians were listening to these rabid extremist anti-vaxxers, then we wouldn't be standing here today talking about the fact that 90% of Victorians have done what I say is the right thing, got vaccinated. We're not divided by this issue, we're united by it.
It's your relationship with the Prime...
Well, it'll be a lot better when he stops double speaking to extremists. And I don't want anyone, whether it be people who are weak leaders or people who are extremists, to take away from what Victorians have built.
Great to talk to you. For his health, for his back.
Yes, exactly.
It caps off a week of ugly pandemic politics and protests.
Not one, but two different protests. The first, fighting Victoria's vaccine mandate and proposed pandemic laws. The second, significantly smaller demonstration rallying against far-right movements.
Tens of thousands against the government's pandemic bill. At the same time, a kilometre away, this group had very different ideologies.
We're here to send. We are very concerned that the anti-vax movement has joined forces with the far right.
It's really important to oppose these anti-vax far-right thugs. We can't let.
It's the first time Melbourne has seen a counter-protest against the anti-lockdown demonstrators. This group, smaller in numbers, but just as vocal.
Similar scenes across the country as COVID rallies spread, including Perth, Brisbane and Sydney. Back here, the large crowd settled in for an impromptu garden concert.
These live chopper shots that are coming into our newsroom, you can see the protesters. Police haven't been able to give us any official word on exactly the behaviour of the crowd today.
Now, guys, of course, we have been talking about the anti-vax pro-conspiracy theory protests across the country yesterday. Here is my rap.
How do we all feel?
The vaccine's killing people.
We're one country. Freedom.
Daniel. Sack that Andrew. Sack that Andrew. Same cult of vaccinists, Mr. Craig Kelly.
And I've seen things.
Gee.
I've approached Daniel Andrews.
We are no longer free.
I have photos.
It's just a disgrace.
There you go, guys. You're welcome. Pretty fresh, pretty fly. You would not shuffle that.
Well, some ugly, ugly scenes in Melbourne. It brings back memories of this. The Capitol Hill riots in Washington.
These are the QAnon, the anti-vaxxers and also, you know, the Nazi supporters. They're the ones that are bringing this really legitimate protest to its knees.
Malandiri, how do you feel about this particular point of the legislation which allows people to be detained indefinitely without charge with no right of appeal to a court and threatening to take over Parliament? It is ugly and we don't want to see that in this country.
And I think what's especially troubling to mainstream Australia is the rest of us see the kind of violent politics that have emerged in the United States in the last couple of years, and we want to reject it. And the Prime Minister seems to want to embrace those kind of violent views and violent threats.
Who have engaged in violence and threats and intimidation and have worked against the vaccination program. I have no sympathy with that agenda.
There were rally cries for freedom in capital cities across the country today as anti-vaccine protesters took to the streets.
In Adelaide, Brisbane and Melbourne.
This sort of violence?
Like Trump, Scott Morrison doesn't want to upset violent extremists. Why?
With another huge protest planned in Melbourne tomorrow and the prospect of more angry words turning violent.
They're not about chasing through doublespeak the votes of extremists or their preferences.
In attempting to keep them on side, the Prime Minister must ensure he doesn't inflame extremists outside his party. Andrew Prubin, ABC News, Canberra.
On the back door, little Lord Statesman, but on the front steps, sucking up to extremists.
The Premier says he hasn't...